Hola, muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Muy buenas tardes para quien nos está siguiendo desde América Latina. En primer lugar, bueno, pues quisiera presentarme. Mi nombre es Iliana Olivier, soy profesora titular en el Departamento de Economía Aplicada, Estructura e Historia de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid y soy, junto con Carlos Gregorio Hernández, quien tomará la palabra después, coordinadora del Máster en Estrategias y Tecnologías para el Desarrollo, cuya edición 2021-2022 estamos abriendo hoy. Así que mi primer saludo es una muy calurosa bienvenida a los estudiantes que se incorporan por primera vez a este título de posgrado conjunto entre las dos universidades, Politécnica y Complutense de Madrid. Bueno, pues es una alegría siempre recibir a estudiantes nuevos y, por supuesto, una gran bienvenida también a los estudiantes de segundo año que comienzan ya su último semestre y, por supuesto, a todas aquellas personas que están siguiendo esta sesión que es de carácter abierto. Tratándose de un acto, digamos, inaugural y de tipo académico, la sesión contará sobre todo, digamos que la parte principal de la sesión es esa mesa redonda coordinada por el profesor David Pereira, profesor también de la Politécnica y profesor del docente en el máster y miembro de la comisión académica del mismo. Coordinará una mesa redonda sobre transformaciones hacia sistemas de alimentarios sostenibles, una mesa redonda en la que participarán también Carlos Geriz y Caroline Steele. No me voy a detener en presentarlos, lo hará luego David de forma mucho más detallada, pero bueno, pues yo no quería dejar de agradecer a David la gestión de esta sesión y dar la bienvenida y el agradecimiento a Gonzalo y a Caroline por acompañarnos en esta sesión de hoy. Además además de esta sesión, bueno, y antes de darles la palabra a David, intervendrá, como dije brevemente, Carlos Gregorio Hernández, quien dará algunas pautas básicas sobre el programa de máster. Al fin y al cabo, esta sesión está dirigida a sus estudiantes, pero bueno, pues hay una serie de dudas que probablemente tengan los estudiantes de nuevo ingreso y también de informaciones de tipo más logístico y operativo que sabemos que resulta útil transmitirles en esta primera sesión, que más bien tendremos, bueno, pues en una sesión ya más restringida a partir de la 1:05, 1:15, ya junto con Mónica del Moral, quien es el alma del máster y que nos acompaña también hoy en esta sesión, Carlos Gregorio y yo misma. Yo no me quiero detener más tiempo, no quiero robar más tiempo del debate y de la mesa redonda, que seguiremos con muchísima atención, así que sin más le paso la palabra a Carlos Gregorio para que también pueda presentarse y darnos algunas indicaciones y luego abrir ya formalmente la sesión que coordinará David. Así que, Carlos, cuando quieras.
Muchas gracias, Iliana. Yo soy Carlos Hernández, coordinador del Máster Universitario en Estrategias y Tecnologías para el Desarrollo de la Cooperación en un Mundo en Cambio por parte de la Universidad Politécnica de Madrid. Y también quiero daros la bienvenida a este nuevo curso, tanto a los estudiantes de nuevo ingreso, los que empezáis en el primer año, como a aquellos que continúan con su segundo año y su último semestre en este máster. Y también una especial bienvenida a nuestros invitados de hoy, Caroline Steed y Gonzalo Iriz, que después van a darnos esta clase inaugural. Yo también, como decía Iliana, no me quiero extender mucho. Después vamos a tener una sesión con los estudiantes para ver esas inquietudes y esa organización del curso. Lo único que quiero destacar es que este es un máster oficial, es un máster que está verificado por la Agencia Nacional de Evaluación de la Calidad y Acreditación del Gobierno de España en 2015 y luego ha sido reacreditado en 2019 y tiene una equivalencia con el Espacio Europeo de Educación Superior al título de nivel de máster. Yo creo que todos comenzamos este curso con la ilusión y la confianza de contribuir al desarrollo en el marco de los grandes retos que tiene la humanidad. Y uno de ellos, y en consonancia con la sesión de hoy, está ese llamada que ha hecho la Organización de las Naciones Unidas para debatir sobre la transformación de los sistemas alimentarios, que este mismo mes de septiembre va a tener lugar en la sede de esa organización. Sobre el máster, bueno, decir que comienza para los estudiantes de nuevo ingreso pues 3 semestres que creo que van a ser bueno, pues muy ilusionantes y llenos de mucho contenido. Vais a conocer a más de 30 profesores de ambas universidades y yo, bueno, pues recordar que este máster de 90 créditos europeos equivaldría a unas 2.000 horas de estudios, de dedicación. Lo tenemos estructurado en 3 semestres, en el cual inicia este primer semestre con la parte obligatoria, la parte común, en la que vais a tener una serie de asignaturas relacionadas con la teoría del desarrollo, con cuestiones sobre la transformación para alcanzar la sostenibilidad, 2 de los temas en los que esta tarde vais a comenzar las clases. Luego van a seguir, bueno, pues toda una serie de asignaturas, bueno, pues tanto instrumentales, de conocimiento, como de aplicación de esos conocimientos generales que todos los estudiantes deben tener. Ahora completaréis ese primer semestre a finales de este año y después dará comienzo la especialización. Hay 2 especialidades, la de políticas y la de tecnología, y ahí vais a cursar 4 asignaturas obligatorias para cada especialidad y luego vais a elegir o habéis elegido ya entre un pool de asignaturas optativas que os permiten cierta especialización. Eso concluirá a finales ya de este curso, para después dar lugar al último semestre, el tercer semestre, el practicum o el profesional, que vuestros compañeros y compañeras de la edición pasada comienzan también en el día de hoy. Y ese semestre, que está configurado en torno a las prácticas profesionales y al trabajo fin de máster, quiero aprovechar aquí también agradecer a todas las organizaciones colaboradoras con el máster, muchas de ellas, algunas estáis aquí o escuchando esta sesión inaugural, agradecer esa acogida que hacéis todos los años a nuestros estudiantes y que forma parte de ese bueno, pues conocimiento hacia los problemas del desarrollo bueno, pues que los estudiantes deben de conocer. Y finalmente termina este máster con el trabajo fin de máster, que en muchos casos se hará en conjunto con esas organizaciones y finalmente el año y medio, a los 3 semestres, concluiréis este máster. No quería extenderme con más detalle, como decía Iliana, después de esta sesión inaugural tan interesante, vamos a tener oportunidad de debatir y de ver vuestras inquietudes sobre la organización del máster. Con lo cual, bueno, pues yo quiero ya invitar a mi compañero y profesor David Pereira, que es el que ha organizado esta sesión inaugural, para que dé paso a la misma. Sin más, muchas gracias por...
Hi, everyone. In the first place, I want to welcome to the new student of this course, of the present course, when we are trying to get back to the teaching face to face, and I want to say welcome also to this session. We selected this topic for the inaugural session because sustainable food system seems to be on the top of the political agenda since United Nations promote the global summit on sustainable food system that will take place on September, at the end of this month in New York. Like energy, like mobility, food is a leverage issue with great relevance for sustainability. It has a strong influence in our environment, in the commerce, in our consumer patterns. So it has a strong influence on sustainability, and depending on how we manage the food systems, we can have several options for our future. So this is a very important question. The way we produce, the way we conserve food, we deliver, we consume food, produce greenhouse gases, so contribute to climate change, but at the same time is affected by the climate change. So we thought that this is a very relevant topic to be discussed in the inaugural session for this year, and that is because we are here this morning. So this morning we have two very interesting panelists. In first place, Caroline Steele is author of the two very, very interesting and surprising books that I recommend to you. Hunger City, How Food Shapes Our Lives, who talks about how the food influence the cities and our patterns of living, and Citopia, how food can save our world, about the necessary transformation that we have to face in the future. And the second panelist is Gonzalo Iriz. Gonzalo Iriz is the representative of Spain to the FAO, but despite of this, we worked together several years ago to introduce the SDG challenges inside in that moment it was the Ministry of Environment, Agriculture and Fisheries and Food Policies. So I think in Gonzalo as a pioneer in the SDG thinking, trying to open and broke the silos inside the Agriculture Ministry in Spain. So we prepared some questions, and I want to say hello to both of them. Hello, Caroline. Are you?
Hi.
Hello, Caroline.
Nice to be with you.
Okay. And I want to say hello to Gonzalo.
Hi.
Hi. So we prepared some a few questions to lead this dialogue. And the first one for Caroline is a very simple question, and a short one. What challenges must we face to improve our world through the food?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, David. I think, I actually come to the subject of food as an architect. And for me, the importance of food is that it's this incredibly powerful agent shaping our world. But we're not necessarily aware of it because we simply wouldn't exist without food. So it's got one of these very rare properties, which is that it's shaping our lives and our cities, our landscapes, our climate, our economies, our politics, our habits. But we kind of can't see its influence very easily. And I think, this year in particular, I mean, we were just talking.
Sometimes it's not easy to see it.
I often say it's too big to see.
Yeah, when I read your first book, I discovered a lot of things, and I used to work in that issues.
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote my first book, Hungry City, I remember, just thinking, this is crazy. Asking the question, how do you feed a city, is a bit like asking the question, what is civilization? And I thought, I can't be the person asking this question. I'm not clever enough. Somebody else must have done this. There must be a whole discipline focused on this. I just haven't come across, and there just wasn't. And I think that as well is a sort of symptom of the fact that I say it's too big to see. So it takes somebody, like me, who's basically ignorant, doesn't know what questions you are and are not supposed to ask, to sort of say something like, well, how do you feed a city? And then all of a sudden, all of these things came to me, as a sort of revelation almost, So for example, if you look at any city founded before the railways, you know, a lot of the street names have food in them, you know, Bread Street, Fish Street, Corn Street, Cow Street, all over the world this is true. Because of course food was physically making its way into the center of the city. And you know, so there's this incredible sort of legacy of the way we've eaten in the past. And of course, the way we eat now, as we know, I mean, I think this year in particular, it's become very visible to people because there's just been a sort of a crazy series of extreme weather events, you know, and I think it's become, I know you've had forest fires in Spain. I saw recently you've had terrible floods as well, you know, the forest fires in Siberia and America. I mean, it's just been extraordinary. And so it really has become unignorable now. And I think, you know, the fact that food is responsible for, well, I mean, Gonzalo is probably more on top of the figures than I am, but, you know, somewhere up to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions are involved in some way in the food system, whether it's the transport or the deforestation or the, you know, the basically the fuel use or the methane emissions from cows and all the rest of it. So the challenge we face is huge because, and I think an important thing to say is that it's related to the bigger challenge that we face of living differently. You know, I mean, I often say that, you know, the most useful role of food for us now is as this kind of lens for asking all the big questions that we have to ask, because we've inherited an idea of a good life from the 20th century and even from the 19th or even 18th century, you could say, which is that, you know, we can use technology to obliterate nature, you know, use as much nature as we need and basically solve the problem of how to live by kind of mastery over the planet. And that's a really dangerous idea to have now, because as we realize, as you know, people like Adam Smith, you know, the fathers of the Industrial Revolution could never have really conceived that we could run out of planet. So we need a different vision of a good life and a different way of living. And I think, you know, rethinking how we eat and how we feed ourselves can be really central to that rethinking. And one other important point to make is that I think part of the problem that we face in transitioning from our way of life now, which is very, you know, kind of fossil fuel dominated, very much about consumption, and very much about sort of the commodification of nature, how we move from that to a way of life that's more about living in balance with nature and actually making and mending stuff rather than just endlessly consuming it. And also, you know, getting pleasure out of things that are not fossil fuel dominated, which is all entirely possible, and some of which has happened under lockdown. But I think, you know, one of the very important things about food is that we all eat every day, you know, and those of us lucky enough to eat 3 times a day, eat 3 times a day, and we are wired to get pleasure out of eating. So if we focus on food as a medium for change, we can actually do a lot of this through pleasure. And I think, you know, in terms of the whole conversation about how do we change our behaviors, that's a really important point to make.
So, but this is, I think, this quite difficult because food is in the center of society, but it's so difficult to change ourselves where we are in the wheels of the big and strong machine.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm not actually saying any of this is easy. I'm saying it's possible.
Okay.
And I mean, one thing that's also very important to say, I think, I mean, you know, Gonzalo is in Rome, you're in Madrid. I mean, you're living in nations where there's still quite an intact traditional food culture. And traditional food cultures generally are very sustainable by definition, because they've existed for you know, hundreds, if not thousands of years. And they're about maximizing the productivity of a territory without destroying the territory, you know. And I think part of the problem that we have in nations like mine, I'm in the UK, America, it would be the leading example of this. And unfortunately, it's the American model that's going global, is that it's not really a traditional food culture in that sense. It's actually an industrial food culture that's evolved with its primary objective of making this thing called cheap food, that actually doesn't exist. You know, as I argue in my book, I think, you know, this is almost the nub of the problem that we face, is that we've built our lives around this idea that food can be cheap, and it can't be cheap, because if you think about it, food is life. You know, food consists of living things that we kill so that we can live. So to cheapen food is to cheapen life. But we've got this idea in our heads that it should be cheap. And of course, there is no such thing as cheap food. So we've achieved this illusion by externalizing the true costs of food, you know, and that is everything from climate change to loss of biodiversity, soil, you know, destruction of soil, deforestation, pollution, all the rest of it. So I think what we need is actually a shift in our value system. And again, that for me feeds directly into this question of what a good life is, because you can't have a good life based on a lie, you know, and cheap food is a lie. And I think, again, you know, the pleasure thing comes into it, because actually, you know, it is the case both in Italy and in Spain that people still understand the true value of food on the whole, you know, and food is very important and is very embedded in the culture. So you're already in a better position, actually, than we are in the UK. Because in the UK, I'm sure you know, we eat more ready meals, for example, than the whole of the rest of the Europe put together. You know, we've got a very industrialized food culture. So actually persuading people to spend money on food in the UK is very difficult. But again, I think you do it through pleasure. And it's been interesting under lockdown that a lot of people have had a lot more time to cook. And actually there's a very interesting survey that came out at the end of the first lockdown that said that people in the UK, you know, were generally valuing food a lot more. They were cooking a lot more, you know, and actually the crisis where all the supermarket shelves temporarily emptied and the panic buying that followed, it actually made people value food more. Now, I mean, I think that is going again, but, you know, that's the kind of thing we have to build on, is to give people the opportunity.
This is an opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an opportunity, exactly.
Okay. So, okay, my next question is for Gonzalo. So what is the international climate to put this question on the top of the agenda nowadays with the Global Summit?
Thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, for having me, and most of all for having me paired with Caroline, which is an honor for me. So thank you very much for this, David. Following your question is that contrary to one might think, is there is not a general political agreement on this. For some time up to now, we have to know that the political climate around food systems is turning uglier and uglier. The polarization of positions is getting worse, and the lockdown and the Zoom relations are not helping at all. So what we were saying is that there is a polarization among countries, and we can start from the word transformation. I mean, it's what we could think that, okay, we have to transform to get better things done. It was quite controversial, and some countries didn't want anybody to tell them that they had to change the way they produced, that they didn't, and most of all, and this is the most important part of it, is that they didn't want anyone to create an international rule or an international agreement so that anyone can tax or even forbid their products to get into another country. And this word of transformation, we can extend it to, as Caroline was saying before, to the use of the planetary limits as a concept, the use of antibiotics, for instance, for food, the agroecology concept, the working living conditions for farmers, the international commerce, deforestation, you name it. There is a controversy and polarization. And the fact is that the current situation calls for action. And the Agenda 2030 decade of action, which is where we are now, was an opportunity to move. And the UN Secretary General gave a step ahead and called for a summit with an ambition and a will of change. We will see that it's not the case these days, but it was what happened
at the beginning.
So we have to understand that this situation is with climate change is destroying the planet, where biodiversity diminishes every day, where hunger is on the rise. We had a curve of hunger that was diminishing up to 2015, and now is growing again. Okay. Which is something amazing. It's a terrible thing to think. Before the pandemic, there were around, I'm talking figures by heart, but around 735 million people hungry every day. After the pandemic, we are over 820, which is 20% more. And 3,000 million people, and I would like the people are attending to sink in these figures. 3,000 million people, half of the population, has not access to a healthy diet every day. There is a growing inequality, and the global food systems are failing for many people. So this is the picture where we are working with, and we should take care of it. And we see that we could say, well, this is there is room for action and there's room for agreement, but what we have seen is that we have seen like three main groups, if I can say. One is, well, in general, Europe and like-minded countries that were really pushing for a transformation based on the farm to fork agenda. Based on climate change, food security, right to food, and not forgetting that not giving away our subsidies, okay? Keeping them together with us because we are very warm with them. And on the other hand, we could say that we have these very hard exporting countries where they put free trade over all other values and change the way they, that's why there is not agreement around all these things that I was saying before, like antibiotics, for instance. And the third one is the civil society, that we thought they would be very much for the transformation, but they are divided. And this is, of course, everything I'm saying is my personal opinion, nothing to do with the Spanish representation.
Official position, yes.
Of course. That they are sometimes jeopardizing the advancements because, I don't know, only the fact that they wouldn't want to approve the initiatives at the CFS at in Rome about agroecology or voluntary guidelines for food security and nutrition. It's difficult to see why they are so divided and against all these advancements. But maybe we can talk about that. But this is the current picture. And I don't know if it answers the question because it's a very complicated one.
Yeah, and I want to back again to the position of the civil society because it seems to, nowadays is quite controversial because civil society is saying that don't have the chance to have a real participation in the summit. What is your opinion about that?
Yeah, I tend to disagree with that.
Yeah,
I mean, the idea is that let me phrase it this way. I am sure that they are right in many things that they are saying. I mean, maybe this isn't the People's Summit that the Secretary General talked about. Maybe the companies have an overrepresentation, but they had the opportunity to take part in it in every single country, everywhere. There's always been a room for them. And if you, what you say before starting the conversation, you say, no, I don't want to sit here. This is again my personal opinion, I thought always better to sit down and say what you want to say, because they have had the opportunity. There's been over 145 countries where national dialogues with the participation of the civil society have taken place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, saying that there was no place for them to talk, I think is saying too much. I don't know if Caroline agrees with that. Maybe she knows better.
Oh, I mean, you're more inside all of this than I am, but I guess what I've read from the outside, as it were, is that what people feel is that because I think the lady who was put in charge, whose name I can't currently remember, but I think she is seen to represent in a way Big Ag, you know, even though it's a side of Big Ag that is kind of involved in trying to farm in a more sustainable way. They still feel that she would have the kind of the big corporate interests at heart. So even if I think people felt that if they came to the summit, their words wouldn't be heard because already the sort of direction was set. So again, this is all I've picked up from the outside, and you know, I can't really comment from a position of authority on this one, but I do think there's a very interesting division. I mean, it's very interesting that Gonzalo is talking about how everything in the food world is split, and I would absolutely agree with that. And I think there are different aspects of this, and I think one is that you know, there is a big division between groups like, let's just say, La Via Campesina, for example. So, you know, groups that, you know, represents peasant farmers and small scale farmers globally, for whom the whole farming agenda is really about food sovereignty. And it's about, you know, access to land, access to water, and being allowed to basically produce your own food in the way that you want. And there's another group that is represented by big agriculture companies who are trying to engineer our way out of the problem. So that basically they're creating precision machinery, for example, that use much more precise doses of pesticide and fertilizer and all the rest of it. Now, I think governments are generally much more behind the second group because very often, you know, they are subsidized and they're big donors, you know, in nations like the United States, for example. So I think there's a perceived power imbalance in the dialogue, you know, and it's certainly true that if you then look at, again, as Gonzalo said, you know, trading, global trade, you know, there's a huge amount of imbalance between nations and the way they trade in food. And this is not a new phenomenon either. So I think, yes, I think the sort of underlying, one of the problems is that there are sort of competing issues here, you know, one of which is about food sovereignty that I would tie directly to this idea of another kind of good life. And one of which is about sort of, if you like, an agenda of how we can more or less keep the power structures as they are, but try and kind of, I would almost say, tech our way out of the problem. And I think these two worldviews are in conflict. And I think that's part of the problem that we face at the moment, is that, you know, everyone's got a slightly different agenda. And as Gonzalo says, we're not pulling together. We're not sitting around a table and addressing the bigger problem, which is that humans aren't going to make it to the end of the century unless we get our act sorted. So, you know, I think more clarity about what's really going on and more honesty would be really helpful. And I agree that just pitch battles, I mean, and of course we live in a world of pitch battles. I mean, you've only got to go on Twitter to see that, you know, nobody has a middle view of anything anymore. You know, everyone has a kind of a very strongly held view over here or a very strongly held view over here. And we actually need to be having a conversation in the middle. So I think that's a big problem.
Sometimes for me, there is a hidden problem because some questions, like, for example, obesity, is getting a problem of the poorest parts of our society. But it doesn't seem to be a problem of right to food or good access to good food. It seems a problem of their own choice, you know? So I think that, food is now a very transversal problem that is affecting a lot of things outside of the produce system. So we have to see a more open system, including a lot of social effects of food, of how we feed. Okay. Well, next question.
Sorry, I'd be very interested to know what Gonzalo thinks of that. And also, I mean, my view is, I think this idea that people are fat because they make bad choices has been completely dispelled. You know, basically, if you are poor and you live in an American city where you have to walk more than 500 yards to buy fresh food, which is known as a food desert, you're forced to live on crisps and Coke. You know, so that we've created these, you know, literally landscapes that are obesogenic, which means simply living there makes you fat. And we've created another historical first in the 20th century, and now the 21st, which is that you could be overweight and undernourished at the same time, because so much of the food, and again, this comes into the whole power structures in food and the profit and all the rest of it, but basically there is much more money selling people highly processed food that's highly branded than there is in selling them a fresh carrot. So if you leave and this is, I mean, there's so many things to say about all of this, but you know, if you leave the feeding of people to food companies, you're going to get basically a sort of great consolidation, which we see globally. So bigger and bigger companies that are more and more powerful, and they don't actually have people's health in mind. They have making profit in mind because they're companies. And so if I can sell you, you know, Twinkies or Kit Kat or whatever it is, and make more money, there's no incentive for me not to do that unless government steps in and stops me from doing it. So I don't think we can have the conversation about obesity without having the conversation about the industrialization of the food system and where all the power lies.
Okay. Gonzalo, and so in this situation, do you think some kind of agreement is going to be reached in this global summit, and what will be the effects on the SDG achieving process? Or
well, first of all, answering what Caroline was asking is that the fact is that many countries, among others, all the European Union, is asking for the summit. One of the summit conclusions is to talk about all forms of malnutrition. Within that forms of malnutrition is obesity, and we explicitly, well, some people don't want to. Some countries, not the EU, but some countries don't want to talk about obesity. But in these all forms of malnutrition, one of these forms is obesity, and we're very much for that. And the other thing about
in this point is very interesting to see the increase of prices of some kind of very specific kind of products like fruits or fresh vegetables, or more than meat, and of course more than cereal-based products.
Yeah. And in fact, there are lots of studies where they say that a healthy diet is much more expensive than an unhealthy one, and that's why one of the reasons. But again, I mean, not everything is black or white, and the food industry and the international trade have done a lot for feeding people and ending hunger, and we have to acknowledge that. And not every solution is going to come from agroecology or organic production. This is not real. And we have to acknowledge all the advancements of technology and that agricultural precision, and that using less and less, you have to see what Europe is doing, the transformation that we are doing here in Europe for using less and less phytosanitary products or chemicals in general and all that. I mean, there must be a balance for that, because we know that without, for instance, food, for example, commodities, commodity foods, maybe a lot of people who have died during pandemic. And these are meant to go through international channels. And we can't think that everything is going to be solved by local producers selling in farmers markets around cities. I mean, we have to find a balance. And I think that answering now your question, David, is that, to my opinion, one of the outcomes of the summit should be that we have to transform all of the systems, because I mean, we have to keep in mind is that the goals of the system were to first of all was to generate action and progress, to raise awareness also. And I mean, we are doing a debate here, and it's an outcome of the summit, if we can say so. We have to develop principles and guidelines for governments. Okay, and we are doing this. And we have to create a system to follow up. And maybe we can talk about that later. But the reality is that although it was supposed to be a People's Summit, and we are seeing that it wasn't that much. I have read on the chat that Jose Maria Medina was saying that not only civil society, that the relator of UN on right to food, well, he wrote a letter that is much harsher than some of the NGOs' letter. But and about Agnes Kalibata, that she was part of the Big Ag and all that. But well, also the head of the action track number 3 was the head of WWF. I mean, we see a lot of things, and we have to think that not everybody is completely wrong or completely right, and that we have to see a lot of positive also. As I think I said before, that there were 145 countries that talked and sat inside their own organization, that they sat to talk about it. And there were, after all this, there were 2,000, what they say, game-changing ideas that are going to be part of what we were saying as principles to guide governments. I mean, not everything is negative around this. And we have to say that at least Europe is pressing very hard to know or to have the scientific, because one of the complaints that I have heard, not everyone, but I have heard about this, is that the conclusion of the summit was too based on scientific groups or scientific universities, and say, well, how can we say that it's too scientific? I mean, we're based on science. So we have to press to know really the true costs of food, and to know not only the negative, but also the positive, the real importance of free trade, but also what can local markets help? How can local markets help? How can, for instance, Europe is pressing also very much for a coalition on family farming, a coalition on indigenous people, and to make them part of the action, part of the solution, not beneficiaries, as in the past century. So I think that we can find some outcomes if the Secretary General is ambitious enough, which for the time being is not the case.
I think we need very more ambitious changes. So our last question for Caroline of this first part, and then we will give you some questions of the public. So the final question, Caroline, as your book said, how can food save the world?
Well, I mean, I would slightly challenge Gonzalo on one of the things you just said, which is that it's all about the science. I mean, of course we need science, And I completely agree, by the way, that there's a lot of false polarities in the food debate, you know, and it's not, you know, local and organic versus kind of big scale. It can be all of the above, but also moving towards a sort of a more sort of concerted vision of what a good 21st century life looks like. But for me, where we're really lagging behind is actually in the non-scientific bits. It's the cultural bits, it's the philosophical bits, it's the political aspects of all of this, where I think we're really lagging behind. I think we have the technology, we have the science, we know what to do, but we lack the political will to do it. And it's also, as we were discussing a little bit earlier on, it's not just kind of getting politicians involved in food again. And I'm very fascinated by the politicians' relationship with food, because I think politicians are terrified of food, because historically, if you look at how difficult it's been in the past, you know, to be responsible for feeding people is politically extremely dangerous, A, because people don't like being told what to eat, and B, if you get it wrong, they come for you. So, you know, I think we have to kind of work together with civil society, with politicians, with scientists, but also with philosophers, if you like, or creators of cultural attitude, to sort of say this is part of a bigger picture, you know, and it's not just how do we feed the world, which I think is an incredibly unhelpful formulation, you know, because the question is, who is we, and does the world want us to feed it, and all the rest of it, you know. So I think we need to kind of reformulate the question and say, how can we as a species create a new idea of a good life that is, you know, is flexible enough that everyone in the world can sign up to it, in essence. So it's ditching, as I said, the 20th century paradigm for a 21st century paradigm, which is about an economy that sits within the ecological possibility of the planet, for example. And how can we share differently? And how can we aim at a good life that is more about sort of, shall we say, management of commons and creating mechanisms that allow us to manage commons in a more effective way, rather than just this kind of these mechanisms we've inherited from a time when basically, you know, using, shall we say, nature in an unlimited way was fine because nobody could conceive we'd run out of planet. So to me, it's more a kind of cultural, philosophical shift that we need now that will allow us to use the science that we already have in a much more intelligent way. So I'll just make that a slight, and you know, and as I say, ironically, I think the good life we could imagine, and that I spend my time trying to imagine, is a better life. It would make us happier, you know, if we shared better. So I mean, that's the positive thing I'd like to offer your students, David, who are probably sitting there kind of thinking, you know, my goodness, you know, what can we do about this? I think there are solutions, and food can help us get to those, but we really need to change the sort of almost the nature of the discourse that we're having.
Mm-hmm. One of the side effects, talking about the students, one of the side effects of the summit, for example, was that it was incredible that our student in agronomy, it wasn't so far away from the question of sustainable food systems, just thinking in food production and almost anything more, no? And now there is a bigger debate in our technical schools that I think is very good for the new professional that has to come. Yeah. Okay, we have several questions.
Excuse me, David, but I would like to answer to Caroline, because very briefly, please.
No, be free. This is the dialogue, and I think.
No, but I think it's very interesting because she's very right. But one thing that I like to say is that because it's not all about science. Of course, it's not all about science, and you can find in every text that FAO, well, not FAO, that the members, the countries that we negotiate, that's what we do in everyday basis here. We talk about taking account local knowledge, and we say it in every single text. You have always that. We have that in mind. Second idea that we want to say is that without the countries, without the ministries of agriculture and all that of every country, there is no transformation. I mean, we need to get the countries on board and politicians on board, because they are the ones that are going to decide how much money is going to they're going to put into that or that other thing. And what we need is to create a guideline for them to follow. And I am very hopeful on this, because if you see the European Union, the difference of the EU from 1992, after McSharry reform, up to our current reform that will start in 2023, I mean, it's amazing. It's really a change of mind. We are having in mind the planet. We are putting the climate change before anything else. I mean, I have hope, very much hope in the future for this. Thank you.
Okay, we had several questions. Some of them are related with the COVID and how press or how was the influence, what was the influence of COVID pandemic to the sustainability of food systems, and if they they were resilient to these global challenges.
I mean, I think there's been, again, sort of, it's a theme that keeps coming back in our conversation. I think there have been kind of equal and opposite results of COVID. So I was speaking earlier about how, you know, in the UK, for example, you know, sort of there's been, I suppose one would have to say, a largely middle class rediscovery of the joys of cooking and fresh food, and, you know, the absolute cliches, making your own sourdough bread, you know, and that's a real phenomenon. But of course, it's very limited in scope. There's also been the opposite. So there's been much more use of food banks, you know, so there's been a large portion of the population that's fallen into poverty. And to me, even more disturbingly, but as I say, the UK is a rather unique example in Europe of having a very, very industrialized food culture, of people going nuts for kind of takeaways and Deliveroo orders online and stuff, and of course buying groceries online. And there's been a massive increase in that. So there's been a further collapse of the high street as a result. Now, I mean, globally, Gonzalo probably has much more access to sort of information there, but I suspect the sort of the effects of COVID in almost kind of increasing the polarization of people's attitudes to food is probably quite widespread. I'm just guessing.
No. If I may, David?
Yes.
Of course, you're completely right. I mean, in Europe, the idea was this one, and there is going back to the grandma's recipes and all that. We've seen it all over. In Italy, I think it was 2 days that the lever to make your own pasta was finished in 2 days. So it's amazing things. But and also have to say that one thing that we could show is that we could see is that in Europe, all the food chain has worked really well. I mean, in 2 days, in 3 days, all the supermarkets were refills and all that, and we have really to thank the flexibility of all these supermarkets and all this, because they were really up to the challenge. But this is Europe, and maybe the US and all OECD countries. But the main effect of the pandemic is that we're having almost 100 million people starving more than we had in the past. And the people had, well, we're saying commodities like cereals and all that, but the local markets were deplenished. And in Europe, we had the infrastructures to create these green channels that they call it. The roads would let only food transport and all that. We could manage to do that, but in the rest of the world, it wasn't possible. So, I mean, the pandemic had a terrible effect on food systems, and it was a bigger reason to know how to transform them.
Mm. And I'd be interested, sorry, I'm now asking Gonzalo a question, but I mean, I'd be interested to know what sort of transformation of the food systems in particular you'd recommend. I mean, I just want to say something else about the UK, which to me is really interesting. We have a massive shortage of HGV drivers, so basically lorry drivers. And actually we're seeing quite major disruptions to the food supply now. And of course, we idiotically, to my mind, voted Brexit. I did not personally. But we're about to put a whole load of trade barriers up between us and Europe. And so we're actually actively just sort of interfering with the food system, which is total madness. But I mean, the HGV thing is really interesting, because even though people are saying it's partly to do with the fact that a lot of our lorry drivers were from Europe and they've gone back home and they haven't come back, it's also because we underpay lorry drivers. We did not value lorry drivers. And indeed, you know, we can't pull our own vegetables out of the ground because we don't value farmers. And it used to be Romanians who came to the UK to pull our food out of the ground, you know. So this is going back to my point about cheap food. We have artificially cheap food by underpaying people who almost everyone who works in the food system is underpaid. You know, and again, I mean, you know, the kind of situation Gonzalo is talking about is you know, at a global scale, but even in the EU, you know, even in sort of rich nations, there's huge instability and fragility in the food system, because we don't value food. You know, we don't pay enough for it, and the people who work in it. So that is a huge structural change that we've got to make. We have to make the argument that food is the most valuable thing in our lives that we have to work to produce. For me, that's the single most important thing. And obviously also acknowledging that we all have to eat. And so there's this sense of sharing, like we share around a table, but at a global scale.
There is a question more or less related with the point that you was, the thing that you was pointing, is about, do we have any example of countries or group of countries that had their good progress, good process of transformation to sustainability in their food systems?
Europe. You've got it here under your feet.
Farm to fork is for you is the right path to.
Maybe it's not the only one. Well, maybe I'm sure it's not the only one.
Mm-hmm.
But we are really making progress to a more sustainable system of production. We are way ahead of many other countries. Mm-hmm. And I mean, sometimes we have to recognize our own efforts and our own success. We have to do a lot more, I'm sure, but we're progressing.
Mm-hmm. And Caroline, your opinion?
Well, I think it's interesting. Again, I don't want, with Gonzalo here, who's such an expert in things, I don't want to sort of come in as with less knowledge and contradict him. But I think, you know, in Europe, there's a very interesting history which comes out of the Second World War, you know, and the fact that we vowed, you know, the kind of the nations who sort of were starving in the war vowed never to be, you know, never to be unfood secure again. And so that, you know, the early days of the common market and the sort of, you know, the European agricultural policy was to just produce vast amounts of food, you know, and that was done with a kind of massive rationalization of farming. Hedgerows were dug up, you know, we went down the kind of, if you like, the chemicals, fertilizers, monocultural route. And yes, we produced a huge amount of food, but that also created a vast amount of problems because you've seen all the statistics about, for example, in Germany, there was a study done a couple of years ago, or it's been going on for 20 years, where there's something like 55% a decline in farmland birds, you know, there's no insects left, you know, so now, I mean, only now, very, very slowly, I would say the EU is recognizing the need to move towards a more regenerative system, but it's coming from a an extreme position of industrialized farming, which is a big part of the problem we face. So I don't know, I don't have quite such a rosy picture maybe. And I mean, again, in the UK, the government is utterly schizophrenic. So they talk the regenerative agriculture talk, and then they do trade deals with Australia, you know, to bring cheap beef in. So there's just utter schizophrenia, I would say. Okay, we just have 3 minutes to finish. One final question. This is by my own. This is my question. It's thinking in our student and the teacher who is joining us today. What is the role of education? What we must do and how we face these challenges, and what professionals we need to promote? Or I mean, I would just very simply say put food at the heart of all education. I don't think there's a more important subject. You know, if we don't eat, we die. And I think you can understand everything that matters in the world through the lens of food. It's so powerful. And, you know, the conversation we've had today has illustrated this. You know, we've gone through everything from ecology to politics to trade to economics to culture. I mean, it's all there. So I think for me, the ideal is that food becomes a major subject, not only in sort of tertiary education, but in all education, primary and secondary. I'd turn classrooms into kitchens with a garden outside. You can learn everything you need through food. Okay, something that you want to add, Gonzalo?
Yeah, well, agreeing totally with her, and well, speaking specifically of university education, is that myself being an agronomic engineer from La Politecnica, I think that we have to get used to know that our job is not just to produce food, but to produce it sustainable, and it should be in the head and hearts of every student nowadays. And that we have to start to think that when talking about food, it's not only about us. I mean, it's not only agronomic engineers or that we know what to do, but we have to listen to other people that maybe know other parts of the story that we don't. And the mix of disciplines and all that, it creates value always. So that's one token, I think, for the university to think about.
Okay, so thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Gonzalo, for this very interesting conversation. When you feel that you need more time, is that the things go very good, and I feel that at this moment we have several questions pending on our chat. So, but I want to say thank you for your participation. Thank you for this very good dialogue between us, and I hope the people enjoy it this morning. Okay, now we are going to pass to the next question. I'm going to start speaking Spanish to the people because I have some messages that I have to say now. And so thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Gonzalo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to you.
It's been a pleasure. Lovely to meet you, Gonzalo.
Same to you. Bye. Thank you, David.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
David. Bye.
Bueno, a ver, espero que os haya gustado esta interesante conversación. Como dijo Mónica al principio, ahora vais a pasar los alumnos que estáis del máster a una sesión privada para hablar de esto. Sí que me han comentado esto, la gente del ITD, de un proyecto en el que se está participando y que puede ser de interés no solo para los alumnos del máster de este curso, sino los de cursos pasados y también para algunas de las personas que están siguiendo esta sesión, que es la posibilidad de participar en el proyecto Food Wave, que es una comunidad internacional de jóvenes activos de entre 15 y 35 años, presente en 17 países, cuyo objetivo es crear conciencia sobre los enfoques sostenibles para consumir y producir alimento en las ciudades. O sea, muy relacionado con el tema que nos ha abordado esta mañana y un poco pretendiendo que los jóvenes tengáis un papel más relevante. Entonces, se ha ido formando un grupo dentro del ITD, digamos, el ITD está haciendo de aglutinante para generar un grupo. Esto en un proyecto que es con la participación del Ayuntamiento de Madrid, y me comentan eso, que si estáis interesados en recibir información y participar, que pues podéis escribir un correo a master.etd@upm.es. Estoy seguro que ahora Mónica o Karen lo pondrán en el chat. Repito, master.etd@upm.es para obtener más información. Y nada, por otro lado, pues yo me despido. Muchas gracias a los participantes y cedo la palabra de nuevo. A Ileana ya la veo que ha conectado la cámara. Hemos ido bien en hora. O sea que muchas gracias a todas y todos.
Muchas gracias, David, y muchas gracias por esta interesantísima mesa redonda. Realmente uno de los objetivos era mostrar los muy distintos ángulos, ¿no?, que puede tener una problemática de desarrollo, desde luego los técnicos, pero bueno, pues ha ido surgiendo en el debate, ¿no?, todas las cuestiones económicas, políticas, sociológicas, antropológicas, culturales, etcétera, históricas, geopolíticas, que bueno, pues que entran en juego, ¿no?, en una problemática como tan básica como esta, ¿no?, como es la alimentación. Entonces, bueno, pues en ese sentido...
Están tanto en el núcleo duro de este máster.
Es que es el
y
núcleo
en el
duro de este
enfoque
máster,
multidisciplinar.
que es exactamente lo que queremos mostrar efectivamente durante este año y medio que pasamos juntos, ¿no?, estudiantes y docentes. Así que bueno, yo sin más, bueno, volver a agradecer a todas las personas que han participado en la sesión, ya sea delante o tras de las cámaras, y bueno, y animar a los estudiantes, sobre todo particularmente los de nuevo ingreso, que se sumen a la sala que ha compartido Mónica, cuya dirección ha compartido Mónica, el Zoom del máster, upm.zoom.us/masteretd, donde nos sumamos, donde entramos ahora mismo, pues Carlos, Mónica y yo, precisamente para daros la bienvenida así ya más en un pequeño grupo y responder a todas vuestras dudas, que suelen ser muchas el primer día de máster y de clase. Así que, bueno, pues yo sin más salgo ya de esta reunión y me despido de todos los participantes y de todas las personas que han seguido la sesión y de nuevo con mi agradecimiento.
Muy bien.